Kid, this isn't a school project. The laughter spread fast through 30 hardened mechanics men who'd spent decades buried in engines, grease under their fingernails, and confidence carved from years of work. But the 20-year-old standing at the edge of that crowd didn't flinch. He looked at the silent motorcycle, the bike that had beaten every one of them, and said 4 words nobody expected. I can fix it. The desert went quiet. If you're watching this right now, subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment telling us what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The rally had been building for 3 days. That was the way it always went with the Hells Angels annual gathering outside Las Vegas. 3 days of engines and dust and desert heat that pressed down on a man's shoulders like something alive. And by the second afternoon, every road leading into the venue was thick with motorcycles moving in packs, chrome catching the Nevada sun, the sound of them carrying for miles before you ever saw them. 3 days of that, and the whole thing felt less like an event and more like a force of nature, something that didn't ask permission and didn't need it. William Carter had been coming to this rally for 31 years. He'd missed it twice, once when his daughter was born premature and spent 2 weeks in a hospital incubator, and once when a bad wreck on Highway 93 had his left arm in a cast from the elbow down and his bike torn apart in a ditch. Both times he said it felt like missing a piece of himself. Not metaphorically, literally. The way an amputee describes phantom pain present insistent, undeniable. He was 63 years old. He had a gray beard that reached the second button of his shirt, hands that looked like they'd been built from concrete and scar tissue, and eyes that had the particular quality of men who've spent decades watching the world without needing to comment on most of it. His road name was Iron Will, and it hadn't been given to him as a compliment. It had been earned the way everything in his world was earned, through patience, through pain, through showing up when showing up cost something. The bike was a 1990 Harley-Davidson Softail. It was 34 years old, and it looked every minute of it, not in a broken way, but in the way of something that had been through actual life, scratched and re-chromed and scratched, again rebuilt in pieces over decades, painted twice, the tank bearing a small eagle decal that William's father had pressed on with his own thumbs the year he finished the original build. The decal had faded to almost nothing. William had never replaced it. He said it would be like erasing a signature. His father, Robert Carter, had built that motorcycle from a half-finished frame he'd bought from a man in Tucson in 1987. Robert wasn't a professional mechanic. He was a plumber by trade, a man who worked with his hands because that was the only world he understood, and he'd spent 3 years putting that bike together in a garage in Henderson, Nevada, working on it after long shifts on weekends in the early mornings before the heat made the garage unbearable. He taught himself carburation from a library book. He'd called in favors to learn the electrical system. He'd made mistakes, torn things apart, rebuilt them, made more mistakes. When Robert died of a heart attack in 2009, William inherited 2 things: a watch that had stopped working sometime in the 1980s and the motorcycle. William kept the watch in a drawer. He rode the motorcycle everywhere. For 15 years after his father's death, that bike had carried him through every mile of grief and celebration and ordinary Tuesday morning that life produced. It had taken him to his youngest son's wedding in Colorado. It had carried him to his best friend Danny Vega's funeral in Phoenix. It had been with him when he found out his mother had been diagnosed with cancer, and it had been with him when she recovered. The bike was not a vehicle. It was the last conversation he had with his father, continuous, ongoing, never finished, which made what happened 3 weeks ago feel like something more than mechanical failure. 3 weeks ago, on a highway outside Henderson, the motorcycle had simply stopped. Not gradually, not with warning sounds or a rough idle or any of the signs a machine gives when it's struggling. One moment William was riding at 60 miles an hour in the middle lane, the engine running smooth, and the next moment, the engine was dead. The bike coasted for 150 yards before he got it to the shoulder, and when he sat there in the heat with cars blowing past him and tried to start it again, nothing happened. Not a cough, not a click, not a sound, just silence. He'd called his chapter's road captain, a big man named Derek Sims, who'd been riding for 40 years and had forgotten more about motorcycle mechanics than most people ever learned. Derek came out with his trailer, loaded the bike, and spent the next 6 hours in his shop going through the engine with a level of thoroughness that bordered on obsessive. By midnight, Derek had his arms crossed and his jaw set in that particular way that meant he'd found nothing, and finding nothing was its own kind of alarming. I'll call Marcus, Derek said. Marcus Hale was the best professional mechanic in their network, a man who ran a shop in Henderson that handled everything from routine maintenance to full restorations, who'd been hired by collectors to bring back bikes that everyone else had written off. He arrived the next morning, spent 3 hours with the Softail, and emerged looking like a man who'd been given a puzzle with a missing piece. I'm going to need more time, he said. He took a week. He called 2 other mechanics to consult, then 2 more. Then a diagnostic specialist from Phoenix who drove 4 hours with a computer system that cost more than most people's cars, plugged it into every accessible system on the bike, ran every test the software offered, and handed the printout to Marcus with an expression that said, "I've got nothing for you." By the end of the 3rd week, 30 mechanics had looked at William's motorcycle. 30. Some of them were friends, some were hired professionals, some were specialists who charged $400 an hour and had restorations in their portfolios that ended up in museums. They had replaced the battery, the starter relay, the ignition switch, the fuel pump. They had rebuilt portions of the carburetor and inspected every inch of the electrical harness. They had pulled the engine apart down to the bottom end and put it back together again. They had argued with each other about causes, placed bets on solutions, and one by one arrived at the same conclusion. The motorcycle was beyond repair. Nobody said it directly. Nobody stood up and made an announcement. But William had been around long enough to recognize the language of men who'd given up, the way their voices shifted, the way they stopped making eye contact, the way the suggestions changed from, "Here's what we should try," to, "At this point you might consider a new engine," and then finally to that particular silence that was worse than any words. He brought the bike to the rally on a trailer. He didn't know why exactly. Maybe because leaving it home felt like giving up on something beyond the machine. Maybe because 31 years of this rally meant he needed to be here more than he needed to make sense. But when he parked the trailer near the mechanics area and people walked over to look at the Softail sitting silent in the desert heat, the story spread fast the way stories do in close communities, person to person, group to group, until it felt like the whole gathering knew. 30 mechanics, all failed. Marcus and his crew were making one more attempt Saturday morning spread out around the bike, with the focused and slightly desperate energy of surgeons who know the odds are bad but aren't prepared to stop. They had the fuel system partially disassembled on a clean cloth beside them. They had a multimeter running checks on circuits that had already been checked 6 times. They were working, but they were working the way men work when they've run out of ideas, motion without direction. Effort without belief. The crowd around them was thick. 20, 30 people watching, giving suggestions, arguing in low voices about whether the problem was electrical or mechanical, or whether the whole engine block had developed a crack too small to see. A woman named Linda Park, who ran the hospitality tent and had known William for 20 years, stood at the edge of the crowd, with her arms folded and her expression doing what everyone's expressions were doing, cycling between hope and the specific sadness of watching something beloved fail. That was when Ethan Brooks walked in. He came through the edge of the crowd without announcing himself, which was partly because he was 20 years old and didn't know most of these people, and partly because announcing yourself in a crowd like this, at a moment like this, would have required a confidence that came from somewhere he hadn't reached yet. He was carrying a toolbox, a heavy dented metal case that had clearly been through decades of use before it ever reached his hands, the latch replaced twice. The handle wrapped in electrical tape that had turned brown with age. He was blonde blue-eyed, wearing jeans with a frayed knee and a leather jacket that was 2 sizes too worn to be fashionable and 1 size too comfortable to be anything but real. He looked like someone who'd spent more time in garages than classrooms, which was accurate. He looked like someone who belonged in the mechanics area, which was also accurate, though nobody there knew it yet. He stopped at the edge of the circle around the motorcycle. He didn't push through. He didn't say anything. He just looked at the bike the way someone looks at something they're trying to understand, quiet still, with all of his attention on the machine and none of it on the 30 people standing between him and it. Marcus Hale noticed him first. "You need something, kid." Ethan's eyes moved to Marcus. "Mind if I take a look?" The laughter started small and spread fast. It wasn't mean exactly. It had that particular quality of laughter that happens when a situation has been tense for too long and something absurd, it appears to release the pressure. A 20-year-old kid with a beat-up toolbox appearing at the moment 30 professionals were admitting defeat was absurd. There was no way around that. One of the mechanics, a big man named Ryan Cooper, who'd been in the business for 25 years and wore his confidence, the way some men wear their road names right on the surface, was the one who said it. "Kid, this isn't a school project." More laughter. Ethan didn't respond to the laughter. He didn't look embarrassed or angry or amused. He looked at Ryan Cooper for a moment with the kind of steady eye contact that didn't contain aggression or challenge, just a very clear statement of presence, the way a person looks at someone when they've decided not to take the bait. Then he looked at the motorcycle again. Who does it belong to? William Carter, who had been standing 15 feet back with his arms crossed in the specific posture of a man trying not to show how much something is costing him, heard the question and stepped forward. "Me," he said. Ethan looked at him. "What happened when it stopped?" William frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "I mean exactly what happened, not what you think caused it. What did it feel like when the engine went out?" It was a strange question. Most of the mechanics had asked William about symptoms, sounds, smells, warning lights. Nobody had asked him what it felt like. William uncrossed his arms. "It felt like someone turned off a switch. No warning. One second the engine was running, the next it wasn't." Ethan nodded slowly. "How long have you had the bike?" 15 years, but it's 34 years old. My father built it." Something shifted in Ethan's face at that. Not a dramatic shift, a small one. The kind that happens when information lands somewhere important. "Can I look at it?" William looked at Marcus. Marcus spread his hands in a gesture that said at this point, "What's the harm?" "Be my guest," Marcus said, and there was still a thread of condescension in his voice. The kind that professional men carry when they're making a concession they expect to prove pointless. Ethan set his toolbox down beside the motorcycle and did something that nobody expected. He didn't open the toolbox. He placed both hands flat on the tank of the motorcycle, closed his eyes for a moment, and was completely still. The laughter that came this time was louder. "Oh, perfect," Ryan said. "He's going to heal it." "Maybe he needs incense," someone else offered. "Maybe a tuning fork." But William wasn't laughing. He was watching Ethan's face, and something about the quality of the young man's stillness made him stay quiet. He'd been around enough people in his life to recognize the difference between someone performing attention and someone who actually had it. Ethan wasn't performing anything. He was somewhere else entirely, somewhere behind his own eyes, where the noise of 30 people mocking him apparently couldn't reach. After maybe 20 seconds, which felt much longer, Ethan opened his eyes and walked to the left side of the bike. He crouched down without a word and looked at the fuel system from below, tilting his head the way a man does when he's listening more than looking. "Did anyone check the fuel line for internal restriction?" he asked without looking up. "First thing we did," Marcus said. "Not external restriction. Internal. Something that wouldn't show on a visual inspection from outside the line." Marcus paused. "We ran pressure tests." "What were the readings?" Marcus named a number. Ethan made a small sound that was an agreement. "That pressure's within spec," Ethan said. "But it's at the low end. If there's something inside the line that's intermittent, something that moves with vibration and then closes off, you'd see that reading. That would have shown up on the diagnostic." Ethan finally looked up at Marcus. "What diagnostic system did you use?" Marcus told him. Ethan nodded. "That system checks overall fuel pressure. It doesn't isolate sections of the line." He paused. "I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying there's a spot in that diagnostic that's blind." The crowd had gotten quieter. Ryan Cooper was still wearing his skeptical expression, but he'd stopped making comments. He was watching Ethan the way you watch something when you're not sure yet what you're looking at. Marcus said, "Okay, so what do you think is in the line?" Ethan reached into his toolbox and pulled out a small light, the kind with a flexible neck and a set of picks. He moved to the connection point where the fuel line joined the carburetor and began a careful, methodical inspection of the section that, as he just explained, sat outside the range of the pressure diagnostic. "I don't know yet," he said. "I need to find it first." "If it's an internal obstruction, it would have shown up when we ran the line through," Marcus said. "Only if it's stationary." Ethan's hands were moving with a precision that was at odds with his age and the casual way he'd been standing a few minutes ago. "If it moves with the bike's vibration, if it was designed to shift position under engine resonance, it would be in the open position when you tested it in the shop. It would close when the bike was running at road speed." The word design landed in the air differently than anything else he'd said. Several people caught it at the same time. Derek Sims, who'd been the first mechanic to look at the bike 3 weeks ago, took a step closer. What do you mean designed? Ethan didn't answer immediately. He was still working the inspection with his light and his pick moving with that same deliberate quiet attention he'd brought to everything since he arrived. Then he stopped. He reached into the fuel line with a pick and very carefully, very slowly drew something out. It was a small piece of metal, roughly cylindrical, maybe 3/4 of an inch long, with a carefully machined taper on one end that was not a natural shape, not the kind of thing that ended up inside a fuel system through wear or corrosion or age. It was a specific shape, a functional shape, a shape that had been thought about. He held it up where people could see it. The crowd was completely silent. That, Ethan said in a voice that had gone very level, was machined to fit this specific fuel line. It's weighted on one end, so it sits in the open position at idle and closes under the vibration frequency that this engine produces at road speed. He looked at it for a moment longer. Whoever made this understood the harmonics of this exact engine. Nobody spoke. Ethan set the piece of metal down on the clean cloth beside the fuel system components. Someone sabotaged this motorcycle, he said, and they did it with enough precision that it would only fail while the bike was actually moving. The words hit the crowd like something physical. William Carter stopped breathing for a moment. He thought about the highway outside Henderson, the way the engine had cut out at 60 miles an hour, the shoulder he'd managed to reach, the curve that had been coming up 200 yards ahead, the long banking curve where you had to lean the bike and trust the machine. If the engine had cut out 20 seconds later, if he'd already been in that curve, leaned over at speed when the motorcycle suddenly went dead underneath him. He didn't finish the thought, but everyone around him was finishing it for him, and the silence that followed was the kind that happens when a group of people simultaneously understand how close something came to being catastrophic. Marcus Hale picked up the small metal piece and turned it over in his fingers. His expression had changed completely. The professional skepticism was gone. In its place was something that looked like the beginning of fury, the slow-building kind that doesn't make noise right away. "This is precision work," Marcus said. "Yes," Ethan said. "This isn't somebody grabbing a piece of scrap metal. No, this was made for this purpose, on equipment." Ryan Cooper, who'd been silent for several minutes, said, "Who the hell does something like this?" Nobody had an answer. But everyone was looking around the gathering at faces they'd known for years, at people who'd been standing near the bike trailer when it arrived, at anyone who might have had access and knowledge and a reason. William was still staring at the small piece of metal in Marcus's hand. "My father built that bike," he said very quietly. "Every custom specification, the carburetor placement, the fuel line routing, everything." He paused. "Whoever made that piece knew things about this motorcycle that weren't in any manual." The implication moved through the crowd like a cold current, because what William was saying, what everyone was now understanding, was that the list of people with the knowledge to create that device was very, very short. Ethan was already moving. He'd set the sabotaged component aside and returned to the fuel system, working methodically through every section with a care that was almost clinical. His hands were steady, his face showed nothing except attention. But William noticed, and later he'd be the only one who caught this, that the kid's jaw had tightened. Not dramatically, just enough. The way someone's jaw tightens when they're angry and they've decided that anger is not the tool they need right now. "Are there other components?" Derek asked. "I don't know yet," Ethan said. "I'm going to go through every system." He spent the next hour going through every system. Marcus Hale, who 30 minutes ago had been the senior professional, dismissing a 20-year-old kid, was now crouching beside Ethan and handing him tools without being asked. Not because Marcus had decided to be humble, Marcus wasn't built for sudden humility, but because his professional brain had correctly assessed what it was watching and made an automatic adjustment. He was watching someone work at a level that deserved assistance. Ryan Cooper was making coffee runs. Nobody remarked on the shift. It happened the way things happen in groups when the reality of a situation changes gradually and then all at once. Ethan found two more anomalies. The first was in the electrical harness, a small modification that would create intermittent signal loss under heat stress, not enough to stop the bike immediately, enough to compound other issues, enough to confuse diagnostics. "This is why the electrical checks came back inconsistent," Ethan said. You'd get a clean reading when the system was cold and a degraded reading after running. It looked like a failing component because that's what it was designed to look like. So there were two separate sabotage points, Marcus said, his voice flat with the effort of containing his reaction. Three, Ethan said. I think there's something in the ignition timing too. I need to get into the primary. The third was the most sophisticated of the three, a modification to the timing mechanism so subtle that it had survived a complete engine teardown by professionals because it required understanding not just the engineering of the Harley-Davidson Softail, but the specific modifications Robert Carter had made to this particular bike over the course of building it. When Ethan extracted it and laid it beside the other components, the three of them together told a story that was difficult to look at directly. Someone had studied this motorcycle. Someone had learned its individual character, the things that made it different from every other 1990 Softail, and then engineered a failure that worked with those specific characteristics against itself. This is months of work, Marcus said. More than months, Ethan said. Whoever built these components, they either spent a long time observing this specific bike, or they had access to documentation that covered every modification Robert Carter ever made. He looked at William. Did your father keep records? William nodded slowly. A notebook. He wrote down everything he changed, every modification, every rebuild, every adjustment. He paused. I've had it since he died. Is it somewhere specific? At the chapter house? The people standing closest to William and Ethan looked at each other. Who's had access to the chapter house? Derek asked. The question hung there. William's eyes moved across the faces of the people around him, people he'd ridden with, eaten with, trusted for years, with an expression that was doing enormous work to remain neutral. A lot of people, he said, over the years, a lot of people. Ethan cleaned each of the three recovered components and lined them on the cloth. Can I hold on to these? He asked William. Why, plum? Because someone made these on a machine, probably a lathe, maybe a CNC machine. He looked at the components. The finish on the edges is specific. If you know what you're looking for, it's like a signature. Whoever made these, if they work with machines regularly, if they have a shop, they make things that look like this. The word signature made several people look at the three pieces of metal differently. Because Ethan was right. They did have a character to them. A precision, but also a particular aesthetic, the taper angle, the surface finish, the choice of material. Consistent, identifiable. Marcus Hale, who had spent 25 years identifying the fingerprints of engine work and could look at a machine component and tell you things about who made it and where they learned their craft, picked up the smallest of the three pieces and looked at it for a long time. Then he set it down and looked at Ethan. You've done machine work, Marcus said. It wasn't a question. My grandfather had a lathe, Ethan said. I grew up using it. These components were made by someone who learned on older equipment. The finish style. Marcus tapped the piece. Older technique, someone who was trained a while ago. Or someone who was trained by someone who was trained a while ago, Ethan said. The crowd was completely quiet. William looked at the three components lined up on the cloth, and for the first time since any of this started, his face showed something other than the careful, neutral expression he'd been maintaining. He looked frightened. Not for himself, something worse than that. If they knew what Robert's notebook said, he said slowly, and they knew how to use a lathe, and they knew this bike well enough to know where these modifications would survive a teardown. He stopped. Ethan watched him and didn't say anything. Then I know whose training this looks like, William said. The words came out barely above a whisper, and the desert air around all of them went absolutely still. The name William almost said hung in the air between them like smoke present, shapeless, impossible to ignore. Nobody pushed him. That was the thing about men who'd been in this world long enough. They knew when to wait. They knew the difference between silence that needed filling and silence that was doing necessary work. The 30 people standing in that mechanics area had ridden through enough hard moments together to understand that William Carter was standing at the edge of something, and whatever was on the other side of it was going to change things in ways that couldn't be unchanged. Ethan set his tools down very carefully. Not dramatically, just carefully. The way a person moves when they've sensed something fragile in the room. You don't have to say it right now, Ethan said. William looked at him. If I'm right, it matters. It matters either way, But saying a name out loud is a different thing from thinking it. And once you say it, the next 24 hours of this man's life go a direction he can't come back from. Ethan paused. So be sure. The crowd shifted. Several people exchanged glances. Marcus Hale, who had been examining the three recovered components with the focused attention of a man doing math in his head, looked up at Ethan with an expression that contained something new. Not respect exactly, or not yet, but the precursor to it. The recognition that the kid had said the right thing when most men in the room would have pushed for the name. Derek Sims exhaled slowly. William, you don't have to decide anything right now. I know, William said, but he didn't move. His eyes were on the three components lined up on the cloth, and the particular stillness in his face was the stillness of a man whose mind was moving very fast underneath an exterior that had learned over 63 years how to hold itself quiet. Ryan Cooper walked back from the direction of the coffee station holding 2 paper cups and stopped when he read the room. He set the cups down on a folding table without saying anything and stayed where he was. My father's notebook, William said finally. What about it? Derek asked. There are 3 people who've spent significant time in the chapter house over the last 2 years, who I've trusted enough to leave alone in there. He stopped. I'm not going to start throwing names around based on a piece of machined metal. That's not how I do things. Fair, Marcus said, but I want to take these pieces somewhere. William looked at Ethan. You said it's like a signature. The machining characteristics. Yes, the way the taper is cut, the surface, finish, the tool marks on the edge of the threading. If you put this next to something made by the same person on the same equipment, you'd see the match. Ethan picked up the smallest component again. This isn't definitive on its own, but it's a starting point. Who else would know what they're looking at besides you? Ethan thought for a moment. A machinist? A good one. Someone who does precision work regularly and has the eye for it. He set the component back down. Or a forensic mechanical engineer. There are people who do this professionally. They look at machined components and identify manufacturing characteristics. Courts use them. Courts, William repeated very quietly. I'm not saying that's where this goes. I'm saying the capability exists. Derek and Marcus looked at each other over William's head with the particular telegraphic communication of men who'd been friends long enough to have whole conversations in a glance. Marcus said carefully, there are 3 possibilities here. Somebody outside the organization did this, which means they had access to the chapter house and to your father's notebook and to this bike at some point when it was unattended. Somebody inside the organization did this. Or, he paused, somebody who used to be inside did this. The third option landed differently than the first 2, because it changed the shape of the question from who has access now to who has ever had access. And that was a much longer list, and everyone standing there knew it. William's jaw tightened. Let's fix the motorcycle first, he said. It wasn't a deflection. It was the specific pragmatism of a man who'd learned through long experience that the order in which you address problems matters. Fix what you can fix, then deal with what you can't control. Grief and rage were real, but they had to wait in line behind the immediate work. Ethan nodded once and picked his tools back up. For the next 40 minutes, the group around the motorcycle reorganized itself entirely without anyone announcing the reorganization. The people who had useful skills moved closer. The people who were there out of curiosity or spectacle moved back. Marcus positioned himself to Ethan's left and matched his pace without being asked. Derek handled materials and kept the workspace clear. Ryan Cooper, who was not a precision mechanic, but was an exceptionally organized man, took over tracking which components had been inspected and which were still pending, calling them out in the systematic way of someone who understood that order was its own form of contribution. And Ethan worked. The thing about watching someone work at a genuinely high level, the kind of level that's the product of years of absorbed instruction and thousands of hours of practice and a particular quality of attention that can't be performed or faked, is that it changes the atmosphere of a space. The people who'd been loudest an hour ago were now the quietest. Not because anyone told them to quiet down, because there's a gravity to real competence and it pulls people toward it. Ethan talked while he worked, not constantly, but in the way of someone who understands that communication is part of the job. The 3 components worked together, he said, working through the ignition timing system with his hands in his light. The fuel restriction causes the primary failure, the engine cuts out. The electrical modification makes the diagnostic picture messy, so when you're troubleshooting, you're chasing inconsistent data. And the timing issue, well, he paused, focused, extracted a small piece with his pick, and held it up. The timing issue is the one that keeps the engine from restarting even after the fuel restriction releases. So even if you found and fixed the fuel issue, Marcus said, the bike still wouldn't start. Not reliably, not at first. It might catch briefly and then die again, which would make you think you hadn't actually fixed the fuel problem. Ethan examined the timing component in the light. It's designed to make you go in circles. That's, Marcus stopped. Sophisticated, Ethan said. I was going to say something less professional. Several people close enough to hear that exchange smiled despite themselves. The kind of small, involuntary smile that surfaces when tension finds a momentary crack to slip through. William, who hadn't smiled at anything in 3 weeks, didn't smile. But something in his posture shifted slightly, loosened a degree. How did you know where to look? He asked Ethan. Ethan was quiet for a moment. My grandfather used to say that when a machine fails in a way that doesn't make sense, when the obvious explanations don't hold up, when experienced people can't find it, you don't look for what's broken. You look for what's been touched. Touched. Everything else on a machine accumulates history, wear patterns, oxidation, the kind of small irregularities that come from years of use. But something that's been added or modified recently looks different. It looks newer than its surroundings, even when someone tries to disguise that. He glanced up briefly. The fuel restriction component had tool marks that didn't match the oxidation on the fitting it was sitting in. The fitting was old. The component was new. Once you know to look for that difference, you can find it. Derek said, none of the 30 of us looked for something that had been added. No, Ethan said without judgment. You were all looking for something that had failed. That's the right approach 99% of the time. This was the other 1%. The sentence settled over the group like a diagnosis, uncomfortable and clarifying at the same time. Ryan Cooper, who had been quiet for an unusually long stretch by his standards, said, how old were you when your grandfather started teaching you this? Ethan thought about it. I don't remember not being in his garage, so young. He's still around. A beat. No, Ethan said. He passed 2 years ago. The simple directness of that answer and the way Ethan's hands didn't pause in their work while he said it told you more about how he was carrying the grief than any elaborate description could have. He'd learned to do the work through it. That was either the healthiest or the saddest form of coping, and maybe it was both at the same time. William heard it and looked at the young man for a moment with an expression that was private and complicated and didn't need any words. Two men who had inherited their most important education from fathers and grandfathers who were gone. Two men for whom a machine was never just a machine. What was his name? William asked. Samuel Brooks. Was he in the motorcycle community? No, he was just a mechanic, small town in Montana. He fixed whatever people brought him. Ethan removed the last of the 3 sabotage components and set it on the cloth. But he believed that if you respected the machine would tell you what it needed. He said most mechanics stopped listening after they got good enough that they thought they already knew the answer. Marcus made a sound that might have been a short laugh and might have been something else. He's describing me, he said. He was describing a lot of people, Ethan said, including himself at first. He told me he spent 15 years fixing things the hard way before he figured out the listening part. And then he became the guy people brought the impossible jobs to. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then how many impossible jobs have you done? Ethan looked up from the fuel system, which he was now reassembling with the 3 sabotage components removed. This is my first one that mattered this much. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The reassembly took another hour. Ethan worked through it with the same methodical patience he'd brought to the inspection, and now the people assisting him had calibrated to his rhythm. Marcus anticipating which tool he'd need next. Derek clearing finished components before they created clutter. Ryan recording each step in the sequence in case they needed to retrace anything. Somewhere around the 40-minute mark of reassembly, Linda Park appeared at the edge of the work area with a plate of food that she set on the folding table near Ryan's tracking notes. Nobody stopped working, but pieces of the food disappeared with the organic efficiency of people who'd learned long ago to eat when food appeared because you couldn't predict when the next opportunity would come. Ethan ate while he worked, one hand on a tool, the other reaching blindly to the plate. Marcus did the same. Derek made a comment about the fact that neither of them had looked up from the engine in 45 minutes, which got a quiet laugh from 3 or 4 people, which was the first genuine group laughter of the day. It was a small thing, but laughter in a group that had been carrying collective tension for hours is its own form of release, and the atmosphere around the motorcycle shifted another degree from the tight, controlled seriousness of crisis toward the focused, forward-moving energy of people who believe for the first time in a while that they might be getting somewhere. William felt it. He didn't say anything about it, but he felt it. He picked up his coffee and stood slightly closer to the work than he'd been allowing himself to stand, as if now it was permissible to believe in proximity to the bike again, as if something had shifted in the calculus of hope. When we reassemble the carburetor section, Ethan said, not looking up, I want to run a fuel flow test before we close it up, just to confirm the restriction is fully cleared. I've got the setup for that, Marcus said. Good. And after that, I want to check the ignition timing against what your father documented, Ethan said to William. If he kept records of the original timing setting, I want to make sure what we put back is consistent with his spec. William set down his coffee. What does it matter if the timing is slightly off from his original spec? Ethan looked at him. It matters because this motorcycle is his. The timing he set is part of what makes it run the way it runs, the way it feels to you, the sound of it. He paused. You said it felt like a switch going off when it stopped. That means your body knows this engine's rhythm. If I bring it back at a different timing, it might run fine technically, but it won't feel right to you. And that matters. Nobody said anything for a moment. William looked at Ethan the way you look at someone when they've understood something about you that you didn't explain. The notebook is at the chapter house, he said, but I remember the timing setting he used. He mentioned it enough times that it's the kind of thing that stays. Tell me, William told him. Ethan made a small note on the back of his hand with a Sharpie and went back to work. The fuel flow test came back clean. The restriction was gone. Marcus ran it twice to confirm, and then looked at Ethan with an expression that had fully completed its journey from professional dismissal to something that looked like collegial respect. We're clear, Marcus said. Good, let's do the timing. The timing adjustment was precise work, the kind that required hands that didn't shake and eyes that stayed focused, and a tolerance for getting the measurement exactly right rather than close enough. Ethan took his time with it. The crowd, which had been given the small relief of the clean fuel flow test, held its new collective energy steady while he worked, not the breathless tension of earlier, but something more like the controlled waiting of people who believe the outcome is tending in the right direction. When he finished, he stood up and wiped his hands on a clean cloth. It's ready, he said. Those 2 words. 3 weeks and 30 mechanics in one 20-year-old kid and 2 words. The crowd reorganized itself again this time, spreading out around the bike rather than pressing in, giving the machine room, giving William room, operating on the collective instinct that this moment needed space. William walked to the motorcycle. He stood next to it for a moment, not sitting yet, just standing. His hand went to the tank, the same gesture Ethan had made at the start of all this, 2 hands flat on the metal. Though William's version was different in quality, where Ethan's touch had been the touch of someone listening, William's was the touch of someone reintroducing himself. I'm still here. Are you? He swung his leg over and sat on the bike. Marcus handed him the key. William took it. His hand was steady. His face was not visibly, but there was something moving behind his eyes that was too old and too deep to hide entirely the accumulated weight of 3 weeks and 15 years and 34 years in his father's hands on this same tank in a garage in Henderson. He put the key in the ignition. He turned it. The silence that followed lasted maybe 2 seconds. It felt like a year. Then the engine coughed. Once. A hard mechanical sound, rough at the edges, like something waking up from a long sleep, and not quite remembering how yet. William's jaw tightened. His hand didn't move. The engine coughed again. This time with more authority, more presence. The beginning of something finding its rhythm. And then the Harley caught. The engine turned over fully and settled into the deep, uneven, unmistakable idle that a well-built Harley-Davidson Softail makes when everything is right, that particular sound that is less a mechanical noise than a voice layered and complex and alive, in a way that no recording or description fully captures. The crowd didn't move for a moment. Then Linda Park made a sound, not a word, just a sound, the involuntary exhale of relief, and somebody in the back said something that was drowned out immediately by the engine noise. As William opened the throttle slightly, not gunning it, just touching it, listening to the response, feeling the way the power moved through the frame, into the handlebars, and into his hands. He listened for maybe 15 seconds. Then he closed the throttle and let the engine settle back to idle, and sat there with his head slightly forward and his eyes closed. Marcus turned to Ethan. "You knew what you were doing the whole time," Marcus said. It wasn't an apology, not exactly. It was something more honest than an apology. It was an acknowledgement made directly without softening from a man who didn't make many of them. Ethan picked up his toolbox. "I had an advantage. I came in not knowing what the problem was supposed to be." "What does that mean?" "It means I didn't already have an answer I was trying to confirm. You'd all been working this for 3 weeks. By the time I got here, you were trying to fix what you thought it was instead of finding what it actually was." He latched the toolbox. "That's not criticism. It's just what happens. It happened to my grandfather, too." Ryan Cooper walked over. He stopped in front of Ethan and, for a moment, didn't say anything, the kind of deliberate pause that comes before something a man has had to work himself up to saying. "I was the one who said it wasn't a school project," Ryan said. Ethan looked at him. "I know. That was wrong, not just rude wrong. You showed up here and I decided what you were before I knew anything about you." Ryan extended his hand. "That's the kind of thing I try not to do, and I did it, and I'm sorry." Ethan shook his hand. "You also handed me tools for the last hour without being asked. That counts for something." Ryan made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and an exhale. "I was trying to make it right." "You did." The handshake lasted a beat longer than handshakes usually do when they're just about politeness. It was the kind that means something. William climbed off the motorcycle and let the engine idle. He stood looking at it for a moment with the engine running, the Harley ticking and breathing beside him, back from wherever it had gone, and then he turned to face Ethan. "You brought my father back," William said. Ethan shook his head. "I brought your bike back." "That's the same thing." Neither of them said anything for a moment. The engine filled the space between the words. "The components," William said. "You still want to look at them." Ethan had the 3 sabotage pieces wrapped carefully in a clean cloth inside his toolbox. "When you're ready, there's no rush." "There is, actually." William's voice had changed. The emotion of the last few minutes had moved through him the way weather moves through present, then past. What remained was something colder and more deliberate. "If somebody built those things to kill me on that highway, then there's a rush. There's been a rush for 3 weeks. I just didn't know what kind of problem I was dealing with yet." The people close enough to hear that sentence went still. Kill was a word that William had chosen carefully and said plainly, and everybody standing there knew that he didn't use words carelessly. Marcus said, "William." "Don't," William said, not unkindly, just definitively. "I know 3 people who had access to the chapter house," he said. "I know one of them who did machine work at some point in his life, who has equipment, who has been—" He stopped, started again, "who has been unhappy about some decisions I've made over the last 2 years." He looked at the 3 wrapped components in Ethan's toolbox. "I'm not making an accusation, but I know who to ask first." Derek said carefully, "You want backup when you ask." "I want Ethan when I ask," William said. Ethan looked up. "Because if there's a disagreement about what these components prove," William said, "I want the person in the room who can explain it better than anyone else can argue against it." Ethan held William's gaze for a moment. The 2 of them, 63 and 43 years apart, connected by nothing except a motorcycle and a dead man's notebook, in a few hours in the Nevada desert, did the kind of silent negotiation that sometimes happens between people who recognize something in each other without having the words for what they're recognizing. "Okay," Ethan said. "Okay," William repeated. The Harley's engine idled between them, and the crowd which had gathered to watch a motorcycle get fixed understood that something larger than a motorcycle was now in motion, that the discovery of 3 small pieces of machined metal had turned a story about mechanical failure into something else entirely, something that had a beginning they were standing in the middle of and an ending that nobody could see yet. Marcus Hale looked at the three components in their cloth wrapping and thought about the machining signature Ethan had described. He thought about the 40-minute radius around this rally. He thought about the shops he knew the people who ran them, the hands that had made things he'd seen over the years. One set of hands came to mind. He almost said the name out loud. He kept it back, for now. Because there was a sequence to things, a right order and a wrong order, and the wrong order had a tendency to make bad situations catastrophic. But the name was there. And from the look on William Carter's face, from the look on Derek's face, from the particular silence that had claimed Marcus's expression for the last 10 minutes, they were all thinking the same name. And the question wasn't whether to follow it. The question is what they were going to find when they did. They drove out in two vehicles. William followed the Harley's engine with his ears the whole time it was running on the trailer, even inside the cab of Derek's truck, even with the road noise and the air conditioning and the radio that Derek had turned off without being asked. The engine sound reached him anyway. That particular idle, that voice, and every mile it stayed steady was a mile William let himself breathe. Ethan rode in the back seat with his toolbox between his feet and the cloth-wrapped components in his jacket pocket. He hadn't asked where they were going. William had said the name of a man, and Derek had nodded once, and that was the whole conversation about destination. Ethan understood that he was now inside something that had rules he hadn't been told, and history he didn't know, and the right move was to do what he was brought for and stay out of what he wasn't. Marcus followed in his own truck. He hadn't been invited. He'd walked to the parking area at the same time as William and Derek, and nobody had told him not to come, which in the specific social grammar of this community meant he was welcome. Ryan Cooper had started toward the vehicles too, but William had looked at him once, not unkindly, the same not unkindly he'd used on Derek's William earlier, and Ryan had understood and stayed behind. 4 people. That was the number William had decided was right without saying so. The man they were going to see was named Carl Briggs. Ethan learned this the way he'd learned most things in the last several hours, by listening to the conversation in the truck without participating in it. William and Derek talked in the front seat with the specific economy of men who'd shared a long history and didn't need complete sentences. Carl had been a member of their chapter for 11 years. He'd been asked to leave 8 months ago. The reasons, as far as Ethan could piece together from what wasn't quite said, involved a dispute about club finances in a series of decisions that William had made as chapter president that Carl had opposed loudly, then bitterly, then in ways that moved past opposition into something the community couldn't absorb. He blamed you specifically, Derek said. I know, William said. He said things. I know what he said. William, I know, Derek. William's voice was flat and measured in the way of someone who had already done this thinking in private and arrived at the other side of it. If it's him, I want to know. If it's not him, I want to know that too. Either way, I'm not walking in there with a conclusion I'm trying to confirm. Derek said nothing. From the back seat, Ethan thought, that's exactly what you told Marcus's team had done wrong. You've been thinking about how not to repeat the mistake since the moment you understood what mistake was made. He didn't say it, but he noticed it. Carl Briggs lived 40 minutes from the rally site off a road that Ethan couldn't have named and wouldn't have found without the truck ahead. He had a property with a workshop, a real one, not a hobby setup. The kind of workshop a man builds over decades of acquiring an equipment, piece by piece, each machine earned and placed and used until it became part of his understanding of himself. When they pulled up and got out, Ethan felt the toolbox in his hand and the components in his pocket and let himself read the property the way his grandfather had taught him to read a garage, not for what was visible, but for what the visible things said about the work done there. He saw a lathe through the open workshop door before anyone said a word. An older model, well-maintained. The kind of machine that produced the surface finish he'd identified on the 3 components. He said nothing. Carl came out of the house before they reached the door. He was in his mid-50s, heavy-set, with the kind of face that had once been open and had closed itself down over time, not from age exactly, but from the accumulated practice of disappointment expressed as hardness. He looked at William and his face did several things in rapid succession: surprise, wariness. Something that might have been shame moving through quickly before being covered by something that wasn't. William, he said. Carl. Neither of them moved toward the other. The distance between them on the gravel was doing a lot of work. Carl's eyes moved to Derek, then to Marcus. Then to Ethan, lingering on Ethan with the specific curiosity of someone who doesn't recognize a face and needs to assign a category to it. Who's the kid? Someone who helped me today, William said. Helped you with what? William looked at Carl steadily. My motorcycle started running again. Something moved across Carl's face. Too fast to name precisely but present. There and gone in less than a second. That's good, Carl said. His voice was level, his hands were at his sides. 30 mechanics couldn't fix it, William said. Turned out the problem wasn't mechanical failure. Carl said nothing. Somebody put something inside the fuel system, William said. 3 somethings, actually. Machined pieces. Custom work. Built to make the bike fail in a specific way, at a specific time, in a specific condition. The gravel between them was very quiet. You want to tell me why you're at my house telling me that? Carl said. Because whoever made those pieces knew this bike intimately, knew the modifications my father made, knew where to put something so it would survive a teardown. William paused. The machining on the components is specific. Ethan here can describe it better than I can. All eyes moved to Ethan. He hadn't expected to speak, but he'd been brought for this in the room. If you could call 4 men standing on gravel, a room had turned toward him with a collective expectation that was very clear. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and unwrapped the cloth carefully. He held the 3 components where Carl could see them without coming closer. These were made on a manual lathe, Ethan said. Older equipment. The tool marks on the threading suggest a machine that's been in use for at least 15 or 20 years. There's a very slight pattern inconsistency on the left edge of the cut that comes from a worn guide. Not broken, just worn. The operator compensates for it in the feed rate, which creates this specific surface characteristic here. He indicated the smallest component. The finish is consistent across all 3 pieces, which means the same machine, probably the same session. Whoever made these is comfortable with manual lathe work. This isn't someone who learned on CNC and switched over. This is someone who learned manual first. Carl hadn't moved. That could describe a lot of people, he said. It could, Ethan agreed. It narrows the population, it doesn't eliminate it. So why are you here? It was William who answered. Because you have a lathe, because you know this bike, because you've been angry at me for 8 months. And because when I told you just now that the bike was running again, something happened on your face that I've never seen on you before. What happened on my face? You flinched, William said. I've known you for 11 years. You don't flinch. The silence that followed was long enough to be its own kind of statement. Carl looked at the 3 components in Ethan's hand. His jaw worked slightly, not speaking something else. The physical expression of a man running calculations behind his eyes, measuring distances between what he'd done and what could be proven, between what he felt and what he was willing to say. Come inside, Carl said. Marcus and Derek looked at William. William said, just me and Ethan. Derek started to object. William stopped him with the same flat certainty he'd been using all day. Not aggressive, just immovable. Derek stepped back. Marcus stayed where he was. Neither of them looked happy. Both of them stayed outside. William and Ethan followed Carl through the house and into the workshop. The workshop was organized in a way that Ethan recognized immediately, the organization of a man who had learned that where tools lived mattered as much as how they were used. Every surface clean, every tool in a place. The lathe was at the far end, and Ethan looked at it the way you look at a thing you already half know. He walked to it without asking permission. Carl watched him go and didn't stop him. Ethan ran his fingers along the guide rail. He looked at the chuck. He looked at the tool rest in the bed, in the way the wear pattern distributed across the length of the machine. Then he picked up a scrap piece of metal from the tray beside the lathe, a test cut, something done recently, and held it next to the smallest sabotage component. The surface characteristics matched, not approximately, exactly. The worn guide on the left edge, the specific feed rate compensation pattern, the finish texture. Ethan set both pieces down on the lathe bed without saying anything and turned to face the room. Carl was standing 10 feet away with his arms crossed and his face doing the extraordinary work of containing something enormous. William was standing near the door watching Carl with an expression that was impossible to read and had clearly taken years to develop. Carl, William said. Carl's arms tightened across his chest. Carl. Don't say my name like that, Carl said. His voice had changed, and the leveled control of it was starting to show stress fractures. Like what? Like you're about to forgive me. Carl's voice cracked on the last word, and he caught it and hardened it and kept going. I don't want that. Don't do that. I haven't decided what I'm going to do. Yes, you have. You decided before you drove here. You decided when the kid described the lathe marks. Carl unfolded his arms and pressed both hands flat on the workbench. You always know before you know. That's the most infuriating thing about you, William. You already had the answer, and you came here anyway because you needed to look me in the face. William said nothing. So look, Carl said, go ahead. The silence between them was the kind that accumulates specific weight, the weight of years and shared history and a betrayal that hadn't been confirmed in words yet, but was fully present in the room regardless. Ethan stood beside the lathe and did not move. Why? William asked. One word, the most important word. And the way William said it, not as an accusation, not with anger, but with the specific, exhausted directness of the man who genuinely needs the answer, was what broke something open in Carl Briggs. Carl's hands pressed harder on the workbench. His head went forward. You know why, Carl said. I know what you told yourself, William said. That's different from why. Carl looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed and hard. At the same time, both things at once, the combination that comes from grief that's been living inside fury for so long, it can't separate itself. You cut me out, Carl said, 8 months ago, in front of everyone. 20 years I gave to that chapter before you were president, while you were president, and you cut me out like I was nothing, like those 20 years were nothing. You stole from the chapter fund, William said, and you lied about it when I asked you directly. I borrowed it. You knew I'd never see it as that. Because you don't bend, Carl said, and the fury was fully out now. Not explosion, but the worst kind, the cold, steady burn of someone who has had this argument 10,000 times in his head. You don't bend on anything. Everything is principle with you. Everything is what things mean. And the rest of us are supposed to just what fall in line. 20 years and one mistake and you throw it away like it cost you nothing. It cost me more than you know, William said, and you put those pieces in my bike anyway. The sentence was a door slamming. Carl's fury faltered. Not disappeared, faltered. The way a fire falters when something cold touches it. I wasn't trying to, he started. You designed them to fail at road speed, Ethan said. Both men looked at him. He hadn't spoken in several minutes, and his voice in the room had a specific quality, not accusatory but precise. The precision of a man describing what a piece of evidence says, not what he feels about it. The fuel restriction component closes under the vibration frequency the engine produces above 50 miles per hour, Ethan said. You knew that frequency because you knew this engine. You designed it to fail at speed. On a highway. He paused. Not in a parking lot, not at idle. At speed. Carl's jaw moved in. What were you thinking was going to happen? Ethan said. The question was genuine, not rhetorical, not a trap. And something about its genuineness, its direct, unadorned curiosity about what was in another person's head, landed differently than anything else that had been said. Carl sat down on the stool beside his workbench. I was angry, he said. His voice had gone flat. The fury had burned through and left something smaller and much more real. I wasn't thinking about what was going to happen. I was thinking about how much I wanted something of his to hurt. Something, William repeated. Not you. I didn't want you to. I wasn't. Carl stopped, put his face in his hands for a moment, took it out. I knew you were a good rider. I told myself you'd pull it to the shoulder. I told myself it would just strand you somewhere, make you feel what it felt like to have something you counted on just stop working. You told yourself a lot of things, William said. Yes, and none of them changed what you actually built. Carl looked at the 3 components on the lathe bed, at his own work sitting there in the open like a confession written in metal. His hands were shaking slightly, not with rage now, with something that had no more hardness in it. No, he said, none of them changed that. Ethan looked at William. William was standing with his arms at his sides and his face doing something that was almost impossible to describe, not rage, not triumph, not the satisfaction of being proven right. Something older and more tired than any of those things. The face of a man who had suspected for days, maybe weeks, and had carried that suspicion alone, because suspicion without proof is just poison. You drink by yourself, and now the proof was here, and the poison didn't go away. It changed form, that was all. My father built that motorcycle, William said. He spent 3 years on it. He wrote down every decision he made, every modification. His voice was very controlled. Somebody used that notebook to kill it. And if they'd gotten the timing right, if that curve had been 30 seconds earlier, they might have killed me too. Carl's eyes were wet. He didn't look away. I know, Carl said. You know, William repeated. I know. The two words sat there small and devastating. William turned and walked to the lathe bed and picked up the 3 components. He wrapped them back in the cloth and held them for a moment looking at them, and then he put them in his jacket pocket. I'm going to need to think, he said, about what comes next. Carl nodded. He wasn't asking for anything. No appeal, no justification, no attempt to redirect what was coming. Whatever armor had been holding him together through the years of anger and the months of separation and the act itself, whatever story he'd told himself to make it bearable, it was gone now. What was left was just a man sitting on a stool in his workshop looking at what his hands had made and what it had cost. William moved toward the door. At the threshold, he stopped. He didn't turn around, but he spoke. The thing you said, about 20 years and one mistake. His voice was quieter than it had been all day. I know it felt like one mistake to you. I need you to understand something. When a man asks me directly if he did something, and I look him in the eyes and he lies to me, that's not the mistake. That's the answer to a question I needed answered. He paused. I didn't throw away 20 years. I made a decision based on who you showed me you were in that moment. Those are different things. Carl said nothing. I needed you to know that, William said. I needed you to understand it wasn't nothing to me either. He walked out of the workshop. Ethan followed. Outside, Derek and Marcus were leaning against Derek's truck, the way men lean when they've been wading through something heavy, not impatiently, just holding their own weight up. They looked at William's face when he came out, and neither of them asked the question directly. William's face answered it anyway. It was him, Derek said. Yes. A long pause. Marcus said, what do you want to do? William put the cloth-wrapped components in his truck and stood with his hand on the door handle. Nothing tonight, he said. Tonight I want to go back to the rally and hear the bike running. I want to eat something. I want to sit with people who aren't carrying this with them. Nobody argued. They drove back in a quiet that was different from the quiet of the drive out. The drive out had been the quiet of approach tense, uncertain, directional. The drive back was the quiet of aftermath, which has more space in it, but also more weight. Ethan sat in the back seat with his toolbox and watched the desert go past in the fading light. He thought about Carl's hands shaking. He thought about the way fury collapses when it runs out of story to sustain itself. He thought about his grandfather, who told him once that the hardest jobs weren't the ones where the machine was broken. They were the ones where the machine revealed something you didn't want to know about the people who'd been around it. The machine tells you the truth, Samuel had said. People usually don't. That's why the machine is easier. Ethan understood what he'd meant by now in a way he hadn't fully understood before today. When they got back to the rally, William pulled the Harley off the trailer himself. He didn't ask for help. He didn't need it. He walked the bike off with the practiced ease of a man who has done this 10,000 times, who knows exactly how much the machine weighs and exactly where his own strength is in relation to that weight. When the bike was on the ground, he started it. The engine caught on the first try. That deep, layered, alive, idle Robert Carter's idle. The timing set to his original specification. The voice of his hands restored to the machine he built in a Henderson garage and passed forward through 15 years of his son's life. William sat on the bike with the engine running and his hands on the grips and his eyes somewhere far away from the desert and the rally and the crowd of people who'd gathered again because the story had kept moving. And people always follow the story. Linda Park stood near the edge of the crowd with her hands pressed together in front of her, watching William's face. Marcus stood beside Ethan and said quietly so that only Ethan could hear, what you did in there, what you said to him about the components closing it at road speed. Ethan said, what about it? You already knew he did it before we walked in. Ethan looked at the lathe scrap he'd held against the sabotage component. The surface match was definitive. That's not what I'm asking. Ethan was quiet for a moment. I had a strong suspicion when I saw the lathe through the workshop door. And you still walked him through it step by step. You didn't push him into a corner. You let him get there. Because pushing people into corners is how you get them to say what they think you want to hear instead of what's true, Ethan said. My grandfather used to say the same thing about machines. You don't force a result. You create the conditions where the result can happen. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Your grandfather sounds like he was something else, Marcus said. He was, Ethan said. He really was. The Harley idled in the late evening air, steady and complex and unmistakably alive. The sound of it carrying out across the desert in the particular way that sound carries an open space far and clean and without any edges. William reached forward and touched the eagle decal on the tank, faded almost to nothing. His father's thumbs pressed there in a Henderson garage 37 years ago, a signature on something that was meant to last. And then from the edge of the crowd, from a direction nobody had been watching, a man walked into the circle around the bike. He was in his 60s, tall, with the kind of posture that comes from spending decades being the person whose entrance changes rooms. He wore no club colors, he wore no insignia at all, and yet the people nearest him moved without being asked the way people move near certain kinds of gravity. William looked up from the tank. His expression, the one that had spent all day being controlled, being calibrated, being held at the specific temperature required for each successive moment, changed completely. Not the change of fear, not the change of anger, the change of something entirely unexpected, arriving at the exact moment when you've used up every resource you had for surprises. Hello, William, the man said. And the name he said it to wasn't the name everyone else had been using all day. He said the name Robert Carter had given his son before the road name existed, before the chapter, before the bike, before any of it. The private name, the one that only people from a specific and long ago chapter of William's life would know. William's hands came off the grip slowly. You've been here the whole time, William said. It wasn't a question. Since this morning, the man said, I needed to see for myself. See what? The man looked at this bike, at Ethan, at the cloth in William's jacket pocket that everyone could see the slight outline of. Whether it was really Carl, he said, or whether Carl was meant to be found. The words rearranged everything. Ethan felt it happen, the physical sensation of a story turning under your feet, the ground shifting to reveal that what you thought was solid was built on something else entirely. Marcus made a sound beside him. Derek had gone completely still. William's face had moved into a territory that none of the day's previous expressions had reached. Say that again, William said. The man said it again. Man. And as he said it, as the second sentence completed itself in the evening air, above the sound of Robert Carter's idling motorcycle, Ethan's mind was already moving backward, through the day, through the three components, through the machining signature, through Carl's workshop, through Carl's collapse, and finding the place where a second interpretation fit just as cleanly as the first, and was in certain ways considerably more frightening. The man's name was Gerald Holt. Ethan learned this the way he'd learned everything today, by paying attention to what wasn't being explained. William said the name once quietly, like a word in a language he hadn't spoken in years. Gerald, and the way he said it carried the specific texture of a history that was long and complicated and not entirely clean on either side. Gerald Holt was 67 years old, and he'd been a founding member of William's chapter before William was president, before William held any position at all. He'd been the one who vouched for William's membership in the first place 25 years ago, when William was 38 and still finding his way into the community that would define the second half of his life. That debt, the debt of being vouched for, was the kind that didn't expire. It just changed shape over time. Gerald had stepped away from the chapter 6 years ago. Not removed, not the way Carl had been removed. He'd stepped away on his own terms, in the quiet way of men who've decided they're done without making an announcement of it, who are present one day and then simply aren't, and everyone understands that the conversation is over. What nobody had fully understood, what William clearly hadn't understood until this moment, was where Gerald had gone. You've been watching the chapter, William said. I've been watching several things, Gerald said. From outside. I have friends in a lot of places, William, you know that. I know you used to. William's voice had the quality of a man recalibrating in real time, adjusting his understanding of the last several hours against a new set of facts. What do you mean when you say Carl was meant to be found? Gerald looked at Ethan first. A long, assessing look, not hostile but thorough. The look of a man who evaluates people as a habit, so ingrained it happens before he's decided whether he wants information or not. "You're the mechanic," Gerald said. "Yes," Ethan said. "You found the components." "Yes." "How long did it take you to identify the machining source?" Ethan said, "About 40 minutes from first contact with the components to the confirmation in Carl's workshop." Gerald nodded. Something in his expression, a micro-expression present and gone, suggested that 40 minutes was either faster or slower than he'd anticipated. "What would it have taken," Gerald said slowly, "for someone who knew about the sabotage to make sure the investigation arrived at Carl's workshop?" The question landed in the group like something dropped from a height. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He was already working backward through the sequence of events, and the calculations were changing as he went. Marcus was the one who said it first because Marcus's mind worked in the specific analytical mode of someone who'd spent decades diagnosing systems and knew that sometimes a diagnosis was itself a product of the system it was trying to read. "Someone would need to make the components distinctive enough to trace," Marcus said. "Distinctive in a direction that pointed toward Carl." Or, Gerald said, "someone would need to arrange for a person with the specific skill set to identify machining signatures to be present at the rally at the right moment." Ethan went completely still. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He stood with his toolbox in his hand and felt the day reorganizing itself behind his eyes with the particular disorientation of discovering that the ground you've been walking on has been constructed. "Say what you're saying," William said to Gerald. His voice had dropped to something very flat and very controlled. Gerald looked at him. "I'm saying that Carl Briggs did build those components. I'm not disputing that. Carl's anger at you is real. His access to your father's notebook was real. His lathe is real, and the match Ethan found is real." He paused. "What I'm asking is whether Carl acted alone or whether someone who understood Carl's anger and Carl's capability gave him a small amount of information at a specific moment that made the idea feel achievable." "Someone pointed him at me," William said. "Someone may have handed him the match," Gerald said while standing next to the gasoline. Derek had moved closer during this exchange, and now he was standing beside William with the instinctive positioning of a man whose body had decided before his mind which side he was on. "Who?" Derek said. Gerald didn't answer that directly. "How did Ethan come to be at the rally today?" The question redirected the room toward Ethan, and the specific quality of Gerald's attention when he asked it made Ethan understand that this wasn't a small question wrapped in casual phrasing. It was the center of something. Ethan thought about it. "A friend told me about the rally, said there might be work there for a mechanic." "What friend?" "A guy I know from a shop in Henderson, Ray DeLuca." Gerald's expression didn't change, but something behind it did, a barely perceptible settling, the way a man's face settles when a number comes in where he expected it. "You know Ray DeLuca," Gerald said. "He gave me work when I first got to Nevada. He's the reason I had a reason to be here." "Did Ray suggest you bring your toolbox specifically? Did he say anything about a particular kind of work that might be needed?" Ethan thought back. He thought about the conversation in Ray's shop 3 days ago, standing near the parts counter. "Big rally outside the city this weekend. You should go. There's always machines that need attention, and you've got skills those event mechanics won't have. Bring your grandfather's box. The old tools read things the new ones miss. The old tools read things the new ones miss." Ethan felt something cold move through his chest. "He said to bring my grandfather's toolbox," Ethan said. "He said the old tools read things the new ones miss." The words came out of him and landed in the group, and everybody heard what was in them. Because Ray DeLuca had been right. The old tools, the tools Samuel Brooks had taught Ethan to use, the tools that gave Ethan the specific tactile sensitivity to surface finish and tool marks that modern diagnostic equipment didn't have, were exactly what had allowed him to identify the machining signature on the 3 components. If Ethan hadn't been at the rally with his grandfather's tools, the sabotage might have been attributed to mysterious mechanical failure and left there, or investigated slowly through channels that would have taken months and might have arrived at nothing. Or it might have been found quickly by the right person following a path that had been made easier to follow. "Ray DeLuca knows Carl Briggs," William said, not a question. "Ray DeLuca," Gerald said, "has known Carl Briggs for 14 years. They grew up in the same county in Arizona. Before Carl found your chapter, he and Ray spent several years working in the same machine shop. The same machine shop. Ethan looked at the components in his pocket. Two men who'd learned machining together in the same shop would have the same techniques, the same surface characteristics, the same compensation patterns from the same worn equipment. The machining signature I found, Ethan said, and his voice sounded strange to his own ears, careful, deliberate, the way his voice got when he was doing precision work and couldn't afford to rush. It matched Carl's lathe, but if Carl and Ray learned on the same machines, the signature would also match Ray's work. The silence that followed was complete. Marcus said, "So the components might not have been made by Carl at all. They might have been made to look like Carl made them," Ethan said. And then someone made sure a person with the specific skill to identify the signature would be at the rally to find them. Gerald was watching Ethan with an expression that had moved into something that looked like respect, not the kind you give a person for performing well, but the kind you give them for getting somewhere you weren't sure they'd arrive. "That's the question," Gerald said. "Not who made the components, who needed Carl to be found holding them." William was quiet for a long moment. The Harley idled beside him, patient and steady, indifferent to human complexity. "Ray was never happy when I became president," William said slowly. "He wanted Carl for the role. He spent a year lobbying for it before I was voted in." He paused. "When Carl was removed from the chapter 8 months ago, Ray disappeared from the periphery shortly after. I assumed he just followed his friend out." "Ray didn't follow Carl anywhere," Gerald said. "Ray has been building something separately, a different community, a different structure." He looked at William. "One that would benefit significantly from your chapter being in disarray, from members not trusting each other, from the leadership being questioned." "He wanted to create a crisis," Derek said. "He wanted to create a specific crisis," Gerald said. "One that would look from inside the chapter like an internal betrayal." Carl's anger at William was real. That's what made it usable. A real grievance, real capability, and a small amount of information delivered at the right moment about where the notebook was kept and how the bike's fuel system was configured. "Carl didn't know he was being used," Marcus said. "Carl thought he was acting on his own anger," Gerald said. "He was. He just also happened to be acting on information someone made sure he had." Ethan thought about Carl on the stool in his workshop. The red-rimmed eyes, the shaking hands, the genuine collapse of a man whose armor failed under the weight of what he'd done. That wasn't performance. That was real. Carl had built those components. Carl had installed them. Carl's anger had been the fuel. Ray DeLuca had lit the match. "Where is Ray now?" William asked. Gerald said, "That's the second question. What's the first? Whether you go to Carl first or Ray first." William looked at the cloth-wrapped components in his jacket pocket. His jaw tightened. Something moved through his face that was the internal processing of a man taking a situation he'd understood one way and turning it to face a completely different direction. "Carl didn't know he was being set up," William said. "Almost certainly not." Which means Carl confessed to something he did while also being a victim of something he didn't know was happening. Yes. And Ray is what? Somewhere. Building his alternative structure, waiting to hear that William Carter's chapter has torn itself apart over an internal betrayal that he designed. "That's my read," Gerald said. Derek made a sound. It was brief and it wasn't a word, but it communicated a complete sentence without needing to be one. William turned to Ethan. "I need you to think about something." Ethan said, "Already thinking about it." If Ray made the components instead of Carl, if he made them specifically to match Carl's machining style because they both learned on the same equipment, could you tell the difference? Ethan was quiet for a moment. It was the kind of question that deserved a real answer instead of a fast one. If they learned on the same machines at the same time, the base characteristics would be nearly identical, Ethan said. But a machine develops individual wear over time. A lathe that's been in Carl's shop for 10 years accumulates different wear than one that's been in Ray's shop. Different feed pressure, different maintenance habits, different use patterns. He paused. If I could look at both lathes and make comparison cuts on both, I could probably differentiate. But it would take time, and I'd need access to both machines. Ray's shop is in Henderson, Gerald said. Everyone looked at Gerald. "You've been preparing for this conversation," William said. "I've been watching this situation develop for 4 months," Gerald said. "I came to the rally because I believed today was when it would move. I didn't know how. I didn't know a 20-year-old mechanic with the right grandfather would be the thing that broke it open." He paused. Some things you can plan, some things you just have to be present for. Ethan thought about his grandfather again. He thought about Samuel Brooks standing in his Montana garage telling a 7-year-old that machines were honest because they couldn't choose to lie. He thought about how far that lesson had traveled to get to this moment, from a small-town garage to a Nevada desert, from a dead man's hands to a living man's motorcycle, to 3 pieces of metal that had rearranged an entire community's understanding of itself. He thought about Ray DeLuca saying the old tools read things the new ones miss, and understood now that Ray had known exactly what kind of reading he was commissioning. He just hadn't anticipated that the reading would go far enough. "He sent me here to find the components," Ethan said. He needed someone credible to find them, someone with the technical authority to make the identification stick. He felt something tighten in his chest, not anger exactly. Something more precise than anger. The specific feeling of discovering that a thing you did with genuine care was done inside someone else's plan. "He used me." "Yes," Gerald said. "He trusted that I'd find Carl and stop there." "Yes. He didn't think I'd trace it far enough to find the second interpretation." "I don't think he considered the possibility," Gerald said. "He knew your technical skill. He didn't account for who taught you to use it." Ethan understood that. His grandfather had never taught him to find the answer. He taught him to keep asking after he found it. William put his hand on the Harley's tank. He stood with the engine running beside him, and his jaw set and his eyes somewhere that wasn't Nevada or the present moment. "I need to go back to Carl," he said. Derek looked up. "William?" Not to confront him, to tell him. William's voice was very steady. He confessed to something he did. He deserves to know that he was also a target. That the reason it was possible was because someone handed him the access and the idea and the anger and let him think it was entirely his own. "That conversation could go several directions," Marcus said carefully. "I know," William said. "Carl's still responsible for what he built and installed. I'm not pretending otherwise, but he's going to spend the rest of his life with this. He should spend it with the complete picture." He paused. "That's the kind of thing my father would have done. The whole truth, not just the part that's convenient." Nobody argued with that, so they drove back out to Carl's property in the same configuration, William and Ethan and Derek in the truck, Marcus following. Gerald stayed at the rally. He made no offer to come, and William made no invitation. Their relationship, whatever it had been and whatever it was now, was navigating its own renegotiation, and that was a different conversation for a different day. Carl was still in the workshop when they arrived. He hadn't moved far from where they'd left him, still on the stool by the workbench, though he'd made coffee at some point, and the mug sat beside him half empty, which meant at some level the mechanical routines of life were still running, even when the rest of it had gone dark. He looked up when William and Ethan came through the door, and his expression was the expression of a man who'd been waiting, not with hope exactly, but with the particular vigilance of someone who knows the next thing that arrives will be significant. William said, "There's more." Carl said, "There usually is." William laid it out. Not gently, not harshly, plainly. The way you give someone information they need when there's no version of it that doesn't hurt. Gerald Holt's arrival at the rally. The question about whether Carl had acted alone. Ray DeLuca's 14-year connection to Carl. The machine shop in Arizona. The possibility that the notebook's location, the fuel system specifics, the precise information required to build something that would survive a professional teardown, that some portion of that information had been handed to Carl deliberately by someone who needed him to act on his anger. Carl didn't interrupt. He sat on the stool and held his coffee mug with both hands and listened to the whole thing. His face went through several things during the telling recognition resistance. The specific fury of a man who's been played, and underneath that fury, something that was almost worse, the relief of a small, dark part of himself that wanted it to be true, wanted some portion of the weight distributed. When William finished, Carl was quiet for a long time. "Ray called me," Carl said, "about 5 months ago, out of nowhere. We hadn't talked in years." "What did he say?" "Said he'd heard about what happened with the chapter. Said he was sorry. Said he knew I was angry and that my anger was justified." Carl set down the coffee. "We talked a few times after that. He mentioned in passing, like it was nothing, that he'd seen your father's notebook in the chapter house. Said he'd been there for some work and William had left it on the table. He described what was in it." Carl stopped. "I didn't think anything of it at the time. It just confirmed what I already knew." that the book existed where it was kept what it said. He told you where the notebook was, Ethan said. He confirmed it. I already knew there was a notebook. Robert mentioned it once years ago, but I didn't know where William kept it or how complete the records were. Carl's voice had taken on the flat quality of a man reciting facts against his own interests. Ray told me the fuel line section was documented in detail. He mentioned it like a curiosity, like, can you believe how thorough the old man was? He handed you the technical roadmap? Marcus said from the doorway where he'd positioned himself without being asked. And then let me do the rest, Carl said. He stood up from the stool, not with energy, but with the mechanical necessity of a man whose body needs to move when his mind is processing something at a level that sitting can't contain. I thought the idea was mine. I thought the anger was enough and the knowledge was enough, and He stopped, pressed both hands on the workbench. I thought it was all me. Your anger was yours, William said. What you built was yours. Ray didn't hold your hands. No, Carl said. He just made sure the door was open. The sentence had a bitterness in it that went beyond the situation, though. The bitterness of a man understanding in real time that his own genuine emotion had been an instrument in someone else's plan. That the most real thing he'd felt in months had been simultaneously the mechanism by which he'd been used. That was a particular kind of violation. Ethan recognized it because he was sitting adjacent to his own version of it, Ray sending him to the rally, trusting that Ethan's skills and Ethan's grandfather's tools would do exactly what they did, and trusting that Ethan would stop at Carl and not look further. Two people used by the same man, one to commit the act, one to confirm it publicly. What happens now? Carl asked. He was looking at William. William looked back at him for a long moment. The history between them was in the room, all 11 years of it, the good years and the bad year, and the moment of direct confrontation when Carl had lied and William had read it immediately, and the chapter had closed between them. Now you come with us, William said. Carl blinked. What? To Ray's shop in Henderson. William's voice didn't waver. You know him better than anyone else in this situation. You know how he thinks. You know his tells. If he understands that you're there alongside me, it changes the dynamic. I want you to stand in that shop and let him see that the plan didn't work the way he expected, William said. I want him to have to look at both of us at the same time. Carl was very still. After everything I did, Carl said. After everything that was done, William said. There's a difference. Carl put on his jacket without another word. They arrived at Ray DeLuca's shop in Henderson at 9:47 in the evening, and the lights were still on inside, which meant either Ray was a man who worked late or a man who was waiting for news and couldn't settle enough to go home. It turned out to be the second thing. Ray DeLuca came to the shop door when he heard the vehicles, in the sequence of expressions that moved across his face in the 3 seconds between opening the door and understanding who was standing in his parking lot was the most honest thing about him that anyone would see that night. First expectation, he'd been waiting for someone. Second recognition of William and the beginning of a prepared neutral greeting. Third recognition of Carl standing beside William. Fourth recognition of Ethan standing beside Carl. The fourth was the one that broke the sequence. Ray's eyes locked on Ethan with a quality of attention that was different from everything else, calculating, reassessing, arriving at a conclusion he didn't want. Ray, William said. William, Ray said. His voice was exactly level. The voice of a man who's had time to build a structure to stand inside when things went wrong and was now standing inside it. Didn't expect to see you here. Didn't expect to be here, William said. Had an interesting day. Ray's eyes moved to Ethan again. Did you find what you were looking for? He was asking Ethan directly, which confirmed what juries had said. Ray knew exactly who Ethan was, exactly why he'd been sent, and was asking now whether the finding had gone where Ray intended it to go. Ethan said, I've found more than you planned for me to find. Ray's jaw tightened, a small movement, controlled. I don't know what you mean, Ray said. Yes, you do, Ethan said. The machining signature matched Carl's lathe. You knew it would because you and Carl learned on the same machines. But I spent time with both lathes tonight. He reached into his pocket and held up the comparison piece he'd cut at Carl's shop and the notes he'd made. Carl's guide wear is on the left. Yours is on the right. Your machines developed different wear patterns over 14 years of separate use. The threading on the fuel restriction component has right-side compensation. He paused. You made the components, not Carl. You installed them yourself or you had access to the bike at some point in the last month. And then you made sure Carl had enough information about the notebook and the fuel system to make him look like the only possible answer. The parking lot was silent. Ray looked at the comparison notes in Ethan's hand. He looked at Carl, who was standing with his arms at his sides and his face doing the devastating work of a man watching a person he'd trusted reveal themselves completely. He looked at William, and then Ray DeLuca did something that none of them expected. He sat down on the front step of his shop. Not a collapse, not a dramatic fall. He simply sat down the way a man sits when he's been carrying something for a very long time and the weight has finally become specific enough that he has to put it somewhere. You found the second interpretation, he said mostly to himself. My grandfather taught me not to stop at the first answer, Ethan said. Ray looked up at him. For a moment, his expression dropped into something human, not remorse, not yet, but the very beginning of the recognition that precedes it. The moment when a plan fails and the person who built it has to look at the wreckage without the plan to stand on. Carl was supposed to be the end of the story, Ray said. Carl was a person, William said very quietly, not a story. Ray looked at Carl. Carl didn't look away. And something passed between them, 14 years of friendship and one enormous calculated betrayal. And Carl's face held steady through it with a dignity that nobody in the parking lot would have expected 2 hours earlier. You used my anger, Carl said. You used my grief. You handed me the tools to destroy myself and called it a courtesy. Ray had no answer for that. He had no answer for any of it. The night air held the specific silence of something that was finished, not resolved, not clean, not simple, but finished in the way that certain kinds of things become finished when the last of their concealment falls away. William looked at the shop door. He looked at Ray on the step. He looked at Ethan, standing with the comparison notes in his hand and the old toolbox at his feet and the entire accumulated weight of a single long day showing in the set of his shoulders. I'm going to ride the motorcycle home tonight, William said. Not to anyone in particular, to the air, to whoever was listening. Nobody told him he shouldn't. Because the bike was running. Robert Carter's engine, his father's timing, his father's specifications intact and restored, and the road from Henderson to wherever William was going ran through the same desert that had been here before any of them, and would be here long after, and sometimes the right end to a day was the simplest one available. You get on the bike, you ride. Part 5, William rode the motorcycle home alone. Not because nobody offered to follow. Derek had offered, Marcus had offered, and Linda Park, who had appeared in the parking lot at Ray's shop sometime during the last hour, in the way that Linda always appeared when things reached their most critical point, as if she had a frequency, for it had offered to drive behind him the whole way. William had thanked each of them and turned each of them down with the same quiet certainty he'd used all day when he knew what he needed and the knowing was not negotiable. He needed to be on the road alone with his father's engine. That was all. Ethan watched the Harley's taillight disappear down the Henderson Road and felt something he didn't have a word for yet. Not quite completion, not quite exhaustion. Something in between, the specific feeling that comes at the end of a day that began as one thing and became something else entirely without ever asking your permission. Derek drove him back to the rally. They didn't talk much in the truck. Derek was a man who understood that some rides were for talking and some were for sitting inside what had just happened, and this was the second kind. He drove with both hands on the wheel and his eyes on the road, and the radio stayed off, and Ethan sat in the back seat with his toolbox between his feet and watched the Nevada dark go past the windows. You did good today, Derek said when they were about 10 minutes out. Ethan said, I did what I came to do. You did more than that, Ethan looked out the window. I almost didn't. I almost stopped at Carl. But you didn't. My grandfather didn't teach me to stop at the first answer. Derek was quiet for a moment. He sounds like he was a hell of a man. He was, Ethan said. He was exactly that. They arrived back into the rally around 11. The event had the late-night quality of large gatherings. Some people had gone to sleep. Some were around fires in small groups. The sound levels had come down from the daytime roar to something more human and close. The mechanics area where the day had started was empty now, except for the folding tables and the residue of work, the clean cloths, the organized tool trays, the spots on the ground where the Harley had stood. Ethan set his toolbox down beside one of the tables and sat on a folding chair and stretched his back, which had been carrying hours of crouched precision work and was making its opinion of that known. Marcus Hale appeared from somewhere. He had 2 cups of coffee and handed one to Ethan without making a production of it. "You should sleep," Marcus said. "In a while," Ethan said. Marcus sat down across from him. He held his coffee in both hands and looked at the empty space where the soft tail had been, and was quiet for a moment in the way of someone who has something to say and is deciding how to say it. "I owe you an apology," Marcus said. "The real one, not the professional version I gave you this afternoon when I said you knew what you were doing." Ethan looked at him. "You don't need to." "I do," Marcus said. "I wrote you off in the first 30 seconds. Completely. You were 20 years old with an old toolbox, and I decided the conversation was already over before it started. And that's not a mistake I made because I was having a bad day. That's a mistake I've been making for 25 years. He looked at his coffee. It's easier to notice when someone younger and better makes you see it directly. Ethan said, "You backed me up for 3 hours once you understood what you were looking at." "That's the baseline," Marcus said. "That's what I was supposed to do from the start." Ethan held the coffee and let the warmth of it come through the cup into his palms, and thought about whether there was anything useful to say versus anything that just filled the space. "My grandfather used to say that the most dangerous thing a skilled person could have was a conclusion they'd already reached," Ethan said. "He said once you had the answer, everything you saw was just evidence for it. You'd look at a machine and see what you expected instead of what was there." He paused. "He made me practice not knowing. He'd give me an engine with a problem and tell me I wasn't allowed to guess until I'd touched every single system, even the ones that obviously had nothing to do with the failure. And that drove you crazy," Marcus said. "Until about the 15th time, then I started understanding why." Ethan looked at the empty space where the Harley had been. "The thing about today, the reason those components survived 30 of you looking at this bike, was that every one of you came in with a framework, mechanical failure, diagnostic process, known categories of problems. And that framework was exactly right for 99% of situations. Ray counted on it. He built the sabotage to live inside the blind spot that framework creates." "He studied us," Marcus said. "He knew how good mechanics think. He designed something that would defeat good mechanical thinking." Ethan turned his coffee cup in his hands. "The only way to find it was to come in without the framework. Which is what you did. Which is what my grandfather trained me to do. I didn't choose it. I was built for it without knowing I was being built." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "Samuel Brooks," Marcus said. "Susuma." "Yes. If he were here tonight, what would he say about today?" Ethan smiled. It was a real smile and guarded, briefly young in the way smiles can be when they connect to something a person genuinely loves. "He'd say I got lucky. He'd say the only reason I found the second interpretation was because Gerald Holt showed up and asked the right question. And if Gerald hadn't been there, I might have left Carl's workshop thinking I was done." Would he be right? Ethan thought about it honestly. "Probably," he said. "Probably yes. I was close to satisfied. The match at Carl's lathe was clean. Carl's confession was real, the logic held. Gerald's question was what broke it open the second time." He paused. "My grandfather would have said, always know the difference between finding the answer and being handed the next question. Gerald handed me the next question." Marcus nodded slowly. "And Ray didn't account for Gerald. Ray didn't account for a 67-year-old man who'd been watching the chapter from outside for 4 months and happened to be standing near a motorcycle when it started running for the first time in 3 weeks." Ethan finished his coffee. He built a very sophisticated plan. He just couldn't plan for everything. "Nobody can," Marcus said. "No," Ethan said. "Nobody can." They sat with that for a while. Around them, the rally settled into its late-night rhythms. Low conversations, the occasional distant engine, the sound of the desert itself underneath all of it, the vast and patient sound of a place that was here before everything and would be here after. Ethan didn't sleep that night. Not from anxiety, not from the residue of adrenaline. He sat in the chair with his grandfather's toolbox beside him and let the day move through him the way you let a long piece of music move through, not processing it, not analyzing it, just letting it complete itself and leave what it left. He thought about a 1990 Harley-Davidson Softail. He thought about a man named Robert Carter who'd spent 3 years building a motorcycle in a Henderson garage and had documented every decision in a notebook because he believed that the decisions mattered, that the choices a man made with his hands were worth recording, that the specific way you did a thing was part of the thing itself. He thought about William Carter, is 63 years old, riding that motorcycle home alone through the Nevada dark, listening to his father's engine in the handlebars, and the seat and the air around him, carrying the day toward whatever came next. He thought about Carl Briggs sitting in a workshop with the wreckage of his own anger and someone else's plan laid out around him, doing the hard work of understanding how both of those things were simultaneously true. He thought about Ray DeLuca on the step of his shop. Ray had said nothing after William left. He'd sat on the step and looked at the ground with the specific blankness of a man whose structure had collapsed and who hadn't yet decided what to replace it with. Marcus had made a phone call. Derek had made one too. Whatever came next for Ray DeLuca would not be coming from this community. It would come from other directions, other consequences, the kind that didn't consult anyone's feelings about it. Ethan didn't know the details and didn't need to. That part of the story didn't require him. He thought about Gerald Holt. Gerald had stayed at the rally. When Derek's truck pulled out to follow William to Henderson, Gerald had been standing near the main tent with a cup of coffee and an expression that said he was prepared to wait as long as was necessary for the next chapter of this to return to him. He was 67 years old and he'd been watching from outside for 4 months, and he'd chosen his moment with the precision of a man who'd spent decades understanding that timing was the variable that made everything else either work or fail. Ethan wondered what Gerald had been in this community before he stepped away. He wondered what the history between Gerald and William contained that neither of them had said directly. He filed it in the category of things that were real and significant and not his business, which was a category he tried to keep honest. He picked up his grandfather's toolbox. He held it in both hands and felt the weight of it, the familiar weight, the weight he'd known since he was a child, the weight of the tools inside and the weight of the hands that had used them before his. Samuel Brooks had carried this box into garages across 3 states over 40 years. He'd fixed engines in Montana and Wyoming and Colorado and Idaho that other mechanics had given up on, not because he was always smarter than the mechanics who'd tried before him, but because he had a specific practice he never walked in knowing what the problem was. He always walked in knowing only that there was a problem and that the machine itself was the only honest guide to finding it. The machine doesn't have an agenda, Samuel had told him when Ethan was 9 years old and had made a guess about an engine before he had properly checked it and had been wrong in a way that wasted 2 hours. People have agendas. They have pride and theory and what they expect and what they hope and what they fear. The machine doesn't have any of that. The machine that is just telling you what it is. Your only job is to listen without bringing your own story to it. Ethan had been 9. He hadn't fully understood. He was 20 now and he understood, and the understanding had cost the day in the specific quality of complete exhaustion that comes from doing work that matters at the level it was meant to be done. He was still sitting with the tool bob in his lap when Marcus came back around midnight. "William called," Marcus said. Ethan looked up. "He made it home. Bike ran perfect the whole way." Marcus sat down. "He wants to know if you'll stay through tomorrow. He's riding the bike up here in the morning. Says he wants to make the last day of the rally and he wants you there for it." Ethan thought about his truck parked at the edge of the rally grounds. He thought about the return drive to his room in Henderson, 300 square feet, and a second-hand bed and a window that looked onto a parking structure. He thought about the series of small jobs he had lined up for next week: tune-ups, oil changes, the honest and ordinary work of a young mechanic, building a reputation, one satisfied customer at a time. "Yeah," he said, "I'll stay." William arrived the next morning at 8:45. The Harley came down the access road to the rally grounds with that engine running exactly the way Robert Carter had built it to run, deep and complex and alive, the timing set to the specification that William had carried in his memory for 15 years without knowing he'd need it. People heard it coming before they saw it, and several of them came out of tents and away from breakfast fires because the sound had traveled through the previous day's events and carried meaning now that it hadn't carried before. William parked the bike near the mechanics area and sat on it for a moment after he cut the engine, his hands still on the grips, his face turned slightly toward the sky in the way of someone taking inventory of something they weren't sure would be there and finding it present. Then he got off the bike and walked directly to Ethan. He didn't make a speech. He wasn't a man who made speeches, and both of them had understood that about each other since approximately the first 10 minutes of their acquaintance. He put his right hand on Ethan's shoulder. The grip was firm and direct and said everything the words would have taken longer to say. "The timing is exactly right," William said. "It sounds the way it sounded the first time I heard it. 30 years ago, the day my father finished the build." He stopped, swallowed once. "I didn't think I'd hear that again." Ethan said, "The timing was already in your memory. I just put it back where it belonged." William's hand dropped from his shoulder. He looked at the bike for a moment with the specific quality of looking that doesn't need to see looks that are really listening. "I called Carl this morning," William said. Ethan waited. "We talked for an hour." William's voice was careful with it. He knows what's coming for him legally from the organization. He's not fighting it, but he also knows now he knows what he was inside of, what he was used for. He paused. "He asked me if I thought he would have done it without Ray." "What did you say?" Ethan asked. "I said I didn't know, and I said that not knowing mattered, because the anger was real, the grievance was real. Ray didn't invent any of that. He just gave it a direction and a key." William looked at Ethan. "Carl has to live with what his hands made, but he also gets to understand that the story was bigger than just his anger. Both things are true at once." "That's an honest thing to carry," Ethan said. "Most true things are," William said. Around them, the rally's last day was starting to assemble itself. The morning sounds of a community waking up, coffee and conversation, and the first engines of the day warming up in different corners of the grounds. The specific texture of a large group that has been together long enough to have an internal weather, a collective mood that moves across it like actual weather. And this morning's mood was something lighter than yesterday's. Not unburdened, the events of the previous days sat in the community's awareness, like a stone sits in water, present and heavy, and altering the shape of the current around it, but lighter. The specific lightness that comes when a crisis has been faced and survived, and the facing has changed everyone who was part of it. Marcus appeared with coffee, as Marcus had apparently decided was his role in Ethan's life, and handed a cup to William without commentary. William took it. "I've been talking to some people in the chapter," he said, "about the mechanics area, about whether we should have a permanent young mechanic presence at the rally going forward. Someone who's learning, not someone who already knows everything." Marcus said, "Because someone who already knows everything has already decided what they're looking for." "Exactly," William said. He looked at Ethan. "The offer is open." Ethan looked at the Harley. He looked at his grandfather's toolbox on the folding table. He looked at Marcus, whose expression was professionally neutral in the way that meant he had an opinion and was holding it back with some effort. "I appreciate that," Ethan said. "Genuinely, but I don't think that's where I'm supposed to be." William said, "Where are you supposed to be?" Ethan thought about Montana, about a small garage in a small town, and a man with 60-year-old tools and infinite patience and a belief that what you did with your hands was worth passing forward. He thought about the 16-year-old version of himself who'd watched his grandfather work and understood for the first time that skill had a language, and the language could be taught. "I think I'm supposed to open something," Ethan said. "A garage, in Montana where my grandfather was. Something small, where I can take the cows nobody else wants and teach the way he taught me." "You're 20 years old," Marcus said. "He started at 18, Ethan said. "He told me he should have started earlier." Marcus opened his mouth and then closed it, which was the sound of a man conceding a point he found genuinely difficult to argue against. "You'll need money," William said. "Practically. Not as a barrier, as a fact to be addressed." "I know," Ethan said. "You'll need equipment." "I have a lathe," Ethan said. "My grandfather's. It's in storage in Montana." "You'll need clients." "I'll find them." Ethan said it without bravado, with the simple certainty of someone who has done a thing and knows from doing it what the next thing requires. "My grandfather found clients by doing work other people couldn't do. I'll do the same thing." William was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to Ethan. Ethan unfolded it. It was a check. The number on it was significant, not extravagant, but real. The kind of number that purchased equipment and covered 6 months of overhead and gave a person enough runway to prove themselves without starving in the process. Ethan looked at the number and then looked at William. "I didn't do this for payment," Ethan said. "I know," William said. "This isn't payment for yesterday. Yesterday can't be paid for in money. He held Ethan's gaze. This is a contribution to a garage in Montana that I believe is going to do something that needs doing. That's different. Ethan looked at the check. He thought about his grandfather's lathe and a storage unit. He thought about the smell of the garage in Montana oil and metal and the particular coolness of a concrete floor that held the cold through summer the way good garages did. He thought about the young version of himself on a stool, watching Samuel Brooks's hands move through a repair that everyone else had given up on. He thought about what it would mean to pass that forward, not as sentiment, as practice, as the living continuation of something that had started long before him and deserved to continue long after. Thank you, Ethan said. He folded the check and put it in his jacket pocket next to where the wrap components had been the day before. The components were with Marcus, now evidence documentation part of whatever process was going to address Ray DeLuca in the days ahead. That chapter belonged to other people. This one belonged to Ethan. Gerald Holt appeared at the edge of the mechanics area mid-morning with the same quality of appearance he'd had the previous evening, present suddenly as if he'd simply been nearby and decided the moment was right to be visible. He walked to where William and Ethan were standing and stopped in the particular way of a man who's been carrying something and has decided this is where he puts it down. He looked at Ethan for a long moment. Your grandfather's name was Samuel Brooks, he said, from Harlan County, Montana. Ethan said yes. I knew him, Gerald said. Mushit, not well. I met him twice, maybe 3 times at events like this one years ago. He came once with a man named Pete Callahan, who rode with a club out of Billings. Gerald paused. I remember his hands, the way he held whatever he was working on, like it was something worth being careful with. Ethan didn't say anything for a moment. The morning air held the information gently. He never mentioned it, Ethan said. He wouldn't have, Gerald said. He wasn't a man who made his connections into a story he told about himself. A pause. He fixed Pete Callahan's bike at one of those events, something nobody else could find. Pete talked about it for years. Gerald looked at the Harley. Seems to run in the family. William said Gerald. Gerald looked at him. Thank you, William said, for watching, for coming. You would have found it eventually, Gerald said, not without Ethan, and not without you. Gerald accepted this without deflecting it, which was its own kind of grace. He nodded once. Then he looked at Ethan one more time with those assessing eyes, and this time the assessment was completed. Whatever judgment he'd been forming across the previous 18 hours had arrived at its conclusion, and Ethan could see that the conclusion was favorable, though Gerald was not a man who announced his conclusions. Your grandfather would have been proud of today, Gerald said. Then he walked back toward the main gathering, and the morning absorbed him the way mornings absorb certain kinds of men present and then gone, and the space they leave changes the quality of the air for a while. Ethan stood with that sentence for a long moment. His grandfather would have been proud, not because Ethan had been the smartest person in the situation, not because he'd beaten 30 experienced mechanics to a solution, not because he'd traced a machining signature through 2 workshops and uncovered a plan within a plan. Samuel Brooks wouldn't have cared much about any of that. He would have cared about the specific thing underneath all of it that Ethan had listened, that he'd walked into an unknown situation without a predetermined answer and let the machine tell him what it needed and followed the truth wherever it went, even when it went further than expected, even when it went somewhere uncomfortable and complicated and human. That was the lesson. That had always been the lesson. You don't bring your story to the machine. You listen to its story, and then you follow it. The last day of the rally was the best one. Ethan wrote it out the way you write out the last day of something present for it, in a way you sometimes can't manage when you don't know its ending. Grateful for the specific shape of it, aware that the shape was partly made by everything that had happened the day before. People came to talk to him. Not all of them, but enough. Men and women who'd been part of the crowd around the Softail, who'd heard how the day went, who had questions about their own machines, or wanted to tell him something about a job they'd had or a mechanic they'd known. An older woman named Pat, who'd been riding for 40 years and had a Sportster that had been making a sound she couldn't identify, asked him to look at it, and he did, and found the problem in 12 minutes. And the look on her face when the sound stopped was the purest kind of professional satisfaction, the kind that has nothing to do with being impressive and everything to do with having helped. Ryan Cooper found him in the afternoon and shook his hand again. This time the handshake had something additional in it. Not the remediation of the previous day's insult because that was already handled, but a genuine warmth, the warmth of a man who'd been changed slightly by events and knew it and was comfortable acknowledging it. If you open that garage, Ryan said, and you need someone to spread the word, I know people in 30 states. Ethan said, I'll remember that. I'm not being polite, Ryan said. I'm being useful. There's a difference. I know, Ethan said. I'll remember it. He left the rally at 4 in the afternoon before the last events concluded. Because the drive to Nevada was long and Montana was longer, and there were things in that storage unit he needed to see. His grandfather's lathe, his grandfather's tools, the ones too large to travel, the workbench that Samuel had built himself from 2x6s in 1971, and that still held level after 50-odd years because he'd been precise about it from the start. William walked him to his truck. They stood at the driver's door with the sun on their faces and the rally behind them, and the road ahead of both of them, different roads, same direction in the way that matters. Come back next year, William said. I'll try. Not as a favor, as a member of something. William looked at him directly. You're part of this story now. That doesn't go away because you drive to Montana. Ethan put his toolbox in the truck bed. He felt the weight of it leave his hands, and the truck accept it. The familiar transaction of a day's work completed, the tools going back to where they rested between uses. Can I ask you something? Ethan said. Yes. The morning after your father finished the build, the first time you heard the engine running, what did it sound like? William was quiet for a moment, not thinking, remembering. There's a difference in how a person's face looks during each. It sounded like his voice, William said. Not metaphorically, I mean it. Actually, the way the engine ran was specific to how he'd built it. His hands were in it, his decisions, his 3 years of Saturday mornings. He paused. When you brought it back yesterday with his timing in it, that's what I heard again. His voice in the engine. Ethan nodded. That's what my grandfather said a good repair was, Ethan said. He said you weren't just fixing a machine. You were restoring the conversation between the machine and the person who made it. William looked at him for a moment. Keep teaching that, William said. Whatever else you do, keep teaching that. Ethan got in the truck. He drove north out of Nevada with his grandfather's toolbox in the bed and a check in his jacket pocket, and the specific kind of tired that is its own form of richness. The tiredness of a day that demanded everything and received it and left something in return. He thought about a garage in Montana. Small to start, 1 bay, maybe 2, the lathe in the back, the workbench along the wall, a sign outside, nothing elaborate. His grandfather's name, maybe. Not as sentiment, but as statement. This is where this came from. This is what this is. He thought about the 16-year-old who'd walk in someday with a machine nobody else could fix and a frustration nobody else had been able to address. And he thought about what it would mean to be the person who looked at that machine without a predetermined answer and listened to what it was trying to say. He thought about Samuel Brooks' hands. He thought about Robert Carter's notebook. He thought about 30 mechanics and one 20-year-old and a Nevada desert and a Harley-Davidson Softail that had come back from somewhere its owner had been afraid to name. He drove. The road was straight and the sky was enormous, and the miles accumulated behind him the way miles do when a person is going somewhere they already know is right without resistance, without second-guessing, with only the clean and certain forward motion of something that has found its direction and intends to hold it. Some skills are built in classrooms and certified on paper and announced in the language of credentials and institutions. And those skills are real and they matter, and the world runs on them. But some skills live in the space between a grandfather's hands and a child's eyes. They travel without documentation. They pass forward through patience and repetition and the specific kind of love that looks like watching someone work and saying nothing until the question arrives naturally. They survive in old toolboxes and worn lathes in the muscle memory of a young person who spent enough mornings in the right garage. Those skills don't announce themselves. They show up when 30 credentialed professionals have given up, and a machine that carries a dead man's voice sits silent in the desert, and a 20-year-old with an old toolbox says 4 words that nobody believes. I can fix it. And then he does. Not because he was the smartest person there, not because experience is worthless or credentials are hollow or youth has advantages that age doesn't, but because someone had loved him enough to teach to teach him how to listen before he learned how to answer. And that sequence, listening first, answering second, was the thing that 30 years of experience had quietly forgotten and one morning in a Montana garage had made permanent. Ethan Brooks drove north into the dark, and the toolbox in the truck bed rode with him, patient heavy, full of his grandfather's instruments, carrying the accumulated weight of every repair that had ever mattered, every machine that had ever told the truth to someone willing to hear it, every lesson that had ever passed from one pair of hands to the next without losing a single thing along the way. That is how real skill travels through the world. That is how it survives. And that is exactly what it did.